So, we've got some new Rush Duel news. Starting from January, there will be a new legend rule in place that says that we'll be able to use one legend monster, one legend spell, and one legend traps for a total of 3 legend cards per deck. So this is an interesting change for a multitude of reasons. First off, whenever you would draw your legend card in a Rush Duel game, it always felt like kind of a bomb. It was a very, very powerful effect that you would draw kind of your one of in the deck and it would have a lot of weight behind it. If you slapped down Monster Reborn and brought back a monster, usually that could be game determinative. You could bring back something to attack the game, bring back your opponent's strongest card, bring back one of your fusion monsters, bring back a fusion material and fuse it into something. In general, Monster Reborn has a lot of impact when it hits the board, and you could say the same thing about something like Mirror Force. When you flip over Mirror Force, generally you're winning that combat. It's a very powerful trap card that can completely blow out your opponent and win you the game on the spot. Again, if your opponent isn't really playing around it, and a lot of time in Rush, you feel like you can't really play around these cards because if you do, you're kind of playing very passively, and the game can be very swingy if you're not going all out every turn. So the flip side to this is that having a one-of legend card in your deck can make it quite sacky. If you draw your legend and your opponent doesn't draw their legend, a lot of the time that can have a big impact on the result of the game. I think no one will argue the fact that legend cards in general are very, very strong. Now, there are some which have a lot more impact than others, and that's another interesting dynamic here. So when it comes to legend cards, monsters tend to get the short end of the stick. A lot of the time, people aren't going to want to include a legend monster in their deck rather than one of the really ridiculous spell or trap cards that you can pretty much slot into anything. A lot of the monsters tend to be archetype specific. Like the ones that we tend to see a lot are things like Leviathan Dragon Daedalus, which needs to be specifically in a water sea serpent deck that's running Umi, and Abyss Soldier, which is another water-centric strategy. But other than those two, typically we're seeing things like Monster Reborn, like Pot of Greed, like Graceful Charity, and like Mirror Force. So in general, monsters aren't really being taken, and that's where I think this change is really good, because now, if you have a monster that's specifically good for your deck or the archetype that you're playing, you can now include that in the deck and not have to worry about it. You don't have to give up your Pot of Greed or your Mirror Force. You can have all of them, which is good for the monsters, because some of the legend monsters are really, really cool, and it would be cool to see more of them in their appropriate decks. When it comes to spells, things get a little bit more muddy. In general, the 3 spells that we're seeing taken a lot are Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Graceful Charity. Now, all 3 of these cards have strengths and weaknesses, but in general, they all pretty much slot into just about anything. So you now have to choose which one of those, or the other myriad of spell cards that we have access to put in your deck, which is cool. It is a bit of a decision point to make. Some decks will rather have the Monster Reborn. Specifically, if you are playing a fusion-based strategy, I tend to find that Monster Reborn is very helpful because you can either bring back the fusion summon fusion monster boss that you've put a lot of resources into getting, or you can bring back one of the fusion materials, which is usually a high-level material involved, and then fuse it together with the lower level material, and bam, you have your fusion online. The tricky part I find is when we get to traps. So right now, I don't really think there is a trap that can rival Mirror Force. Now, there is something like Torrential Tribute, which is a good trap card, but Mirror Force in general seems a lot stronger because you can use it in retaliation to your opponent's attack. So now what I would expect to see is most people just on Monster Reborn Mirror Force and then Archetype Monster, which if that's what Konami's going for with this change, fantastic. It means that they're going to get exactly what they want. But right now I just don't feel like there's enough variety of powerful traps that can rival the power of Mirror Force. So back when Legends were still new, back when Rush Duel was still quite a young game, we had some weaker legend cards. I think the very first legend card released was Blue Eyes White Dragon, just a vanilla 3000 attacker, and Dark Magician, just a 2500 attack vanilla attacker. So nothing particularly interesting. But as we went on a few sets, we got things like Trap Hole and Tribute to the Doomed. Now, both of these cards offered different strengths and weaknesses. Trap Hole didn't really have a cost. You just needed your opponent to summon a monster, you flip it over, it's gone 1 for 1, easy peasy. Tribute to the Doomed was a little bit more different because you need to discard a card from your hand and you couldn't use it reactively during your opponent's turn. So you had to basically use it proactively. So in some situations, being able to respond and destroy one of your opponents in their turn is a lot more valuable than being able to destroy it during your turn. And sometimes it's not. But that's what made it interesting, because now you had to choose between what type of removal you wanted from your legend slot. In general, around this time, we started to see people move away from the vanilla monsters and over to these removal spell trap cards because they just added more value. Now, things got a little bit more complicated when maximums were introduced into the game, because maximums generally have trap destruction protection. So that means that something like Trap Hole will be a lot less appealing than something like Tribute to the Doomed, which can just destroy a maximum monster as long as that monster doesn't have any other kind of protection on it. Maximums also influence cards like Monster Reincarnation. Almost all the time, Monster Reborn is better than Monster Reincarnation because you don't have to discard a card and the card goes straight to the field. So if you bring back a powerful monster, you don't have to tribute monsters to get it out. But maximums can only be maximum summoned from the hand, which means Monster Reincarnation had its own little niche of being able to add a card back to your hand and then get it out with a maximum summon. Again, adds a little bit of variety to the deck building because depending on what deck you're going for, you have different spells which can facilitate your strategy. With the release of the Rush Duel disc, Mirror Force was introduced to the game, a card that was so powerful it can single-handedly swing games on its own. Mirror Force has plenty of ways to be played around, such as switching some of your monsters to defense mode, summoning a maximum monster who's just unaffected by trap cards, or using one of the many spell cards that protects your monster from being destroyed by trap cards, such as Secret Order, Ancient Barrier, or Aegis of the Five Houses. Slight tangent here, but it feels like Secret Order was kind of slyly put into the game as a countermeasure to the very powerful Mirror Force trap card. And it feels like we've had quite a few cards now which are kind of almost designed to play around Mirror Force just because Mirror Force is so strong. Now that Secret Order has become such a strong meta threat though and is now used in pretty much every single powerful meta deck, we now see Konami designing cards specifically to deal with Secret Order, which basically means that Konami keep digging a hole and then trying to dig themselves out of it, but in general seem to dig deeper. But monsters are generally a little bit less generic, but some seem good enough to just chuck into a deck, such as Jinzo, who has a decent body and the ability to negate trap cards is pretty good. You could probably chuck that in pretty much any deck and be fine. Now, it will obviously be better in a machine deck, but it's fine. Summon Skull is another one. 2500 attack on a 1 tribute monster is pretty good. Again, better in a Fiend deck, but I could see just a generic deck being like, oh, I just want another 2500 attacker, bam, Summon Skull. Pitch Black Warwolf and Mirage Dragon both offer a 1600 body for a level 4, which is on the same kind of power level as Transamu Rhynak, but also offers the ability to turn off your opponent's trap cards during the battle phase. So again, anti-Mirror Force, so we could start seeing these cards be used quite a lot more. I could also start seeing the 1900 vanilla monsters in Vorse Raider and Alien Shock Trooper, primarily probably in the Beast Warrior and Reptile decks, but I could see them being used in other places just if you don't have any other generic monsters you want to be jamming. Leviathan Dragon Daedalus and Abyss Soldier are already seeing play, so I expect to still see them knocking about. And any deck that's primarily Dark monsters will probably make some good use of Dark Lord Zerato. To go with the Legend rule change announcement, we're also getting a new booster pack in Legend Awakening Pack, which is a special pack that will include multiple Rush Duel Legend cards that were big names throughout OCG history, as well as support for existing Legend cards. Now, hopefully that doesn't include support for Mirror Force, because again, that card is already pretty bonkers. We don't need things like Mirror Force Launcher and the other Mirror Forces brought into the game. Until we see the set list though, it will be difficult to say how it will affect the Rush Duel metagame, but I would be surprised if it didn't at least shake things up a bit. But it's not being released until March 4th, 2 months after the Legend rule change, which means we will have at least a small period of time where we will have only access to the Legends we currently have and the new set that's coming out. So for my final thoughts, I like the idea of being able to use 3 Legend cards and that you're limited to 1 monster, 1 spell, and 1 trap. I think the trap will almost always be Mirror Force. The spell probably be a toss-up between Monster Reborn and Graceful Charity most of the time. Having the freedom to use a Legend monster though is a welcome inclusion. I'd still like to see some of the more powerful and generically good spell traps more restricted by something like a Forbidden or Limited list, just because things like Secret Order, Thunderbolt, Mirror Force, I feel like they've been around for a little bit too long. They've had a little bit too much dominance over the metagame. It would be nice to see them kind of disappear. So, predictions for new Legend cards that could come out in the Legend Awakening pack. It's hard to predict what might come out, but we have just had equip spells introduced into the game. So from that point of view, I could see something like United We Stand or Premature Burial just being able to be introduced, as well as support for equips, so things that could like tutor out equips, search them from your deck, maybe recycle them from the graveyard, that sort of thing. I could also see Lightning Vortex coming in, because I think with Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute, we're not afraid of introducing board wipes. I don't think Konami would want to include Reigeki or Dark Hole, because those could just end the game immediately. Just one card wipe the board seems a bit ridiculous, but Lightning Vortex only destroys a face up and has to discard a card, so I think that might be a little bit more balanced for Rush. But yeah, those are my thoughts, feelings, and opinions. I think overall it'll be positive. I think, like I was saying, the only thing I dislike is that a lot of the time there isn't a lot of thought put into which Legends you want to use. It'll just be Mirror Force, Monster Reborn, Graceful Charity. And I guess what I'd like is to see a bit more variety in choice for Legend cards, which hopefully the new Legend Awakening pack will offer. But maybe you think that what I've said here is completely wrong and you have a completely different opinion. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. And thanks for watching.